Hello everyone. I want you for a moment to imagine that 3,500 years ago, so 1400 BC roughly, you are on the hill of Tara in County Meath, and you are at a burial place which would later become known as the Mound of the Hostages. It is a high status burial area where the likes of kings, lords and other high ranking individuals were buried. And you were at the burial of a man. Just as you were about to leave the burial site, you notice somebody throws in these blue stones. You wonder to yourself, what are these stones? Where did they come from? What is their story? In the present day, 3,500 years after that event, scientists and archaeologists find these stones. They recognize them as faience beads, a type of artwork normally associated with Northern Africa or what they call the Near East. Just to be sure, they send them to a science lab to be tested, and they are indeed found to be of the same chemical structure as Egyptian faience beads. This shows that Ireland and Egypt were inextricably linked as far as 3,500 years ago. What it also implies is that Ireland, particularly the elites, were embedded in a Mediterranean luxury trade because basically what they believe happened was that the beads went from Egypt to Southern Europe, from Southern Europe possibly either to Northern Europe or straight from Southern Europe to Ireland, and ended up in a burial site in Tara, County Meath. But it does show that Egypt is connected to Ireland, which is a bit of a weird one, but it actually has a lot of moments since then where Egypt was completely under the radar connected also to Ireland. But the earliest of Egypt-Ireland contact, and this is an important note, is actually not cultural as it was in, let's say, often in Argentina and South Korea, as in my previous episodes, but actually economic. So there was a trade route somehow from Egypt all the way to Ireland. As you would expect for such a tenuous is not the right word, but such a almost random link, there's quite a gap in the record then, but they do pop up again earlier than you might expect in early Christian Ireland. So about 400 to 800 AD, Irish Christianity, if you look at it, is not Roman in one sense. It is actually Egyptian. The monks at the time looked to the likes of Anthony of Egypt and Paul of Thebes and said to themselves, these guys are going out into the desert, finding God essentially by, having time to themselves. So what can we do? And they said, what we can do is we can go to islands like Skellig Vihil or Skellig Michael and set up huts there like they have in the desert and live lives essentially the same as the hermits in Egypt. You might be wondering, where do they get this idea? Well, there is a book called The Litany of Angus around 800 AD, so kind of towards the tail end of the early Christian intellectual transfer, as it's called. And in that book, there are 7 or 8 monks mentioned as the Egyptian monks of Ulster. So from that, you can see that not only was it, ideas kind of floating over time, there was actual movement of individuals from monasteries in Egypt or hermitages in Egypt to monasteries in Ireland. And that is why Ireland has quite a strong connection to the monastic life and had particularly in the past. So the likes of very ascetic practices, isolationism to a degree, and is extrapolated from the whole wilderness idea that was found in the or the monks that came from Egypt to Ireland. So again, another random but cool Egypt-Ireland link. But it wasn't just in the people, because some instances, I'll get to the Book of Kells in a minute, so keep listening, but there is also a book called the Fodden Moor Psalter from North Tipperary that was found and was in pretty bad shape, but when it was analysed, they found that one of the reasons it was in bad shape was that it wasn't made from calf skin or vellum like most books were, but the binding of the book was actually made from papyrus. So there was trade, most likely due to the Egyptian to Irish links, of like literally people links. There was also trade in papyrus. So you think of papyrus as an Egyptian thing. Nope, it was found in a book from Ireland from around the same time as the monks were found. So it wasn't just the beads that prove that there was a economic link between Egypt and Ireland going back centuries. Even religious books, this in this case called the Fodden Moor Psalter, if you want to look it up yourself, were found to have Egyptian links and are proof of not only the Irish Church participating in Mediterranean intellectual markets, but literally an Egypt to Ireland trade route. That's not something you thought you were going to listen to when you opened this episode, is it? I said I'd get onto the Book of Kells, and here it is. Because you may know that in Ireland we are Roman Catholics, a lot of us. However, in Egypt, you will have probably heard of the term Coptic Christian. That is essentially a kind of Christianity that started up in around the Egypt area. However, all the way back in the Book of Kells, which is like the most famous Irish Christian book probably of all time, there is Coptic iconography or Coptic iconographic style, essentially religious images in the style of ancient Egypt, or ancient to very old Egyptian Christianity. And also, there is proof in these books of a thing called a flabella. And what a flabella was in Egypt, they basically used giant fans to stop flies getting at the Eucharist. However, they also used these as evidenced in the Book of Kells and other Irish books in Ireland, where you're not going to have flies annoying things from the heat. But they still thought that they looked nice, most likely that's why they used them, and still used Egyptian flabella or fans all the way in Ireland. And why don't I take you on a little bit more of a journey all the way to medieval Ireland? At the time, you'll have to understand that the church in mainland Europe was very much, oh yeah, we stand with Rome. Whereas the church in Ireland was very much like, well, we're like ages away from Rome. We're like ages and ages away. So let's do them one up. And they said, oh no, our origins come from a Christian princess called Scota in Egypt. Actually, it turns out that this was complete weaponization of Egypt and the pharaonic system, because apparently, according to all evidence so far found, this Scota person didn't exist. So basically, they were like, yeah, we'll just pretend that the Scota exists and that makes us older than Rome, aren't we great? But no, apparently she never existed. Apparently, this queen of the Egyptian Empire never existed. Speaking of empire, have you ever heard of General John Maxwell? Well, he was essentially the head of the British forces in 1916, and also the head of the Black and Tans when they came in Ireland. But also, shortly after, so kind of 1919 onwards and into the 1920s, Egypt decided to somewhat copy Ireland and have their own rebellion. And the British army decided, well, General John Maxwell fairly well snuffed out the people in Ireland, or so they thought. So let's send them over to Egypt. And they used the exact same techniques. So essentially, Ireland was used as a training ground for General John Maxwell to stop the insurgency in Egypt in 1919, after he stopped the Irish one in 1916. And during that 1919 rebellion in Egypt, there is a very famous letter called the Zifta letter, where an Egyptian revolutionary met with Australian army men and thought, oh, we're on the same side here, because he thought they were Irish and would understand the Irish rebellion. But no, they were in fact Australian, and go look up that letter. It's a very interesting read altogether. And he most certainly wasn't alone, because the Black and Tans, who were the auxiliaries or World War I veterans, also fought with him against both the Irish and the Egyptians, only 3 to 4 years apart. From the battlefields of literal battlefields to the battlefields of war, you get Italia 90, Ireland's finest moment in sporting history, the Soccer World Cup, or football if you're English or not Irish or Australian or American. You probably call it football, but we call it soccer. And in the Soccer World Cup, there was a very boring match which neither team needed to win. And there was one point in that match where the goalkeeper held onto the ball from a back pass for around 6 minutes. After that match, FIFA inserted a rule that there wasn't allowed that the goalkeeper wasn't allowed to catch the ball after a back pass, and that match was between Ireland and Egypt. So again, the systematic changes of the world that affected the entire world were from the Irish-Egyptian relationship. And to finish off, I'm going to just tell you about something that proves, as the old saying goes, the Irish are everywhere. That is the Grand Egyptian Museum. If you've ever been to Cairo, I haven't, but I'm going to pretend that I have. You see this wonderful, beautiful museum right in the heart of Egypt with this wonderful, beautiful post-imperial architecture built by, of course, an Irishman. Or should I say, Irish woman, because Roisin Hennigan was the founder, or co-founder, of Hennigan Peng Architects, and they were employed to build what is now the Grand Egyptian Museum. So, if you ever come to Ireland and are interested in Egypt, visit the Hill of Tara, and if you ever visit Egypt and are interested in Ireland, visit the Grand Egyptian Museum and ask them about Hennigan Peng Architects. What this actually shows, without saying it at all, is that 3 things always reoccur. Trade systems, religious systems, and imperial systems, as you've seen, just pop up again and again and again and again with connections between Ireland and Egypt. And all of those systems rely on people and power, from the myth of Scota to the very much not myth of General John Maxwell. And to sum it all up, you could say that Ireland and Egypt are repeatedly entangled every time the global order reorganizes itself. This is not symbolism, it is a documentable bilateral relationship unfolding across, as I said, 3,500 years between Ireland and, weirdly, Egypt. If you enjoyed this, please follow Liam Blake Podcaster on Instagram. Follow this podcast if you can in whatever app you are listening to it. Like and comment. And also, this episode is one of my first in a long while that I am trying to do them semi-scripted, and I think I've done quite a poor job. But regardless, comment below what you think of this. On that note, thank you and goodbye.